At dawn, the forest was still, not peaceful but hollow. The mist lay low between the trees, soft as smoke, and the air carried no birdsong, no rustle, not even the slow chatter of insects that once owned the silence. Everything stood waiting, as if the world had paused mid-breath and decided never to exhale again. The owl's cry had come 3 nights ago, just once. It had cut through the fog like a blade, echoing down every valley, across every hollow log, through every nest that still remembered wings. And then, nothing. Since that sound, the forest had changed. The man who lived by its edge was the first to notice. He was old enough to remember when the woods had a voice, when wind meant something, when branches whispered instead of stood in judgment. His cabin was small, built from the same trees that now stood silent. Its walls creaked like bones adjusting in their sleep. Every morning, he stepped outside before the light reached the ground. He would wait, eyes fixed on the tree line. He did not call, did not move. He only listened. This morning was no different. The air was damp. The fog tasted like rust. The forest stood before him like a painting that had stopped aging. He whispered, "Still nothing." Behind him, the kettle whistled faintly, the only sound of life left. He poured the water, hands trembling slightly, and watched the steam rise in the dim light. It curled upward, brushed the ceiling, then faded, the same way everything did now. By midday, he took his usual path into the trees. It was the same path he'd walked since his wife had died, a ritual that gave shape to the hours. The ground was soft beneath his boots, wet with the weight of an unfallen rain. The forest had always been quiet in winter, but this was different. Not rest, not peace. Something had gone missing. As he moved deeper, he noticed the trees leaning inward, as though listening. Their trunks were dark, slick with moisture, their roots swollen from years of holding too much. No sound but his own steps. Then he saw it. Near the old well, at the clearing's edge. Feathers, scattered gray and pale, damp from the mist. They formed no shape, no pattern, just a memory of what they had belonged to. He crouched beside them. There was no blood, no sign of struggle, just feathers, perfectly clean. He picked one up, turning it in the light. The barbs were frayed, brittle. The center was hollow, lighter than it should have been. He frowned, glancing upward. The trees stood motionless, every branch outlined against the white sky. He whispered, "You left, didn't you?" His voice broke the air like a foreign sound. The forest did not answer. He looked down at the well, a stone ring filled with fog, its water invisible beneath. Once, people had said the owls nested in its walls. They said their cries were what kept the forest awake. His wife had believed that. She used to leave breadcrumbs and broken eggshells at its edge. "So the forest doesn't forget," she'd said. Now, the well was quiet. He reached into his coat, pulling out a small wooden carving, an owl, worn smooth by years of holding. He set it on the rim of the well and stepped back. The mist moved faintly, just enough to ripple. He leaned closer. "You can't all be gone," he said softly. "There's always one left." Something deep below stirred. Not sound exactly, but the echo of one. A pulse too slow to belong to the living. He froze, leaning closer still. The fog trembled once, then stilled again. The forest remained silent. He stayed there until the light began to fade. The mist thickened, rising to his knees, his waist, his chest. He could barely see the outline of the trees now, only their shapes, like sentinels carved from old grief. When he finally turned back toward the cabin, the forest seemed to exhale behind him. A sound so faint he might have imagined it. A creak, a breath, a whisper of wind. But he didn't look back. Inside, he lit a single lamp. The yellow glow filled the room, soft and trembling. On the table, he laid the feather he'd found. It looked almost translucent now, as if the light passed through it without resistance. He sat beside it for hours, waiting for something. A sound, a sign, a shadow across the window. None came. And when he finally closed his eyes, the forest outside stood awake, holding its silence like a wound. Somewhere deep within the trees, beneath roots and soil and years of sleep, something turned once, slow, deliberate, and then went still again. The nights had grown heavier since the owl's cry. The forest no longer slept. It simply endured. Each evening the fog returned, thicker than before, spreading over the ground like breath too tired to rise. The man had begun waking in the small hours, his chest tight, his ears straining toward the window as if expecting a sound that never came. On the fourth night, he heard it. At first, he thought it was the wind, but there was no wind. Not anymore. The noise came low and steady from beyond the cabin wall, like the slow exhale of something enormous. It wasn't threatening, but it wasn't kind either. It was patient. He held his breath and listened. The sound came again, closer now, deep and deliberate, as though the earth itself was remembering how to breathe. He rose and dressed without light. The floorboards creaked, but the sound outside didn't change. When he stepped out into the cold, the fog swallowed him instantly. His lamp cast a short, trembling circle around his boots, and the air smelled of wet soil and bark that had been split open by frost. He walked toward the well. The sound led him there, a pulse, distant but guiding. The feather he'd left on his table was still in his pocket, and he pressed it between his fingers as if to remind himself he was real. When he reached the clearing, the well was half hidden under mist. The small wooden carving of the owl still sat on the rim, but it was covered in condensation, glistening like it had been sweating in the cold. The trees surrounding the clearing loomed taller than he remembered, their trunks slick, their branches bare. The sound came again, not from the well this time, but from the trees themselves. A deep, muffled vibration. He took a step forward. "Who's there?" No voice answered, but the sound deepened, echoing faintly from trunk to trunk. He turned slowly, realizing it wasn't one tree. It was all of them. The forest was breathing. He pressed his hand against the nearest trunk. The bark was cold, rough, but beneath it, a tremor. Faint, rhythmic, like the slow heartbeat of something enormous and asleep. He closed his eyes, feeling the vibration travel through his arm into his ribs. "You were waiting," he whispered. "For him." The words left his mouth like steam, vanishing almost before they were spoken. He thought of the owl, of its last cry splitting the night. Maybe it had been warning them, or maybe it had been a farewell. He leaned closer, his forehead touching the bark. "What are you trying to say?" The tremor changed. For a moment, it almost sounded like words. Syllables made from pressure and pulse, a language older than voice. He couldn't understand it, but he felt it. The message wasn't meant to be heard. It was meant to be remembered. He whispered, "You dreamt of him, didn't you?" The forest answered with silence, not absence, but refusal, the kind of silence that weighed something. When he pulled his hand away, a thin film of moisture clung to his skin, sap mixed with dew. It glowed faintly under the lamplight, golden in color, alive. He wiped it on his sleeve, but the scent stayed, sharp, metallic, like iron and honey. Behind him, something creaked. A branch bending, maybe. He turned, lifting the lamp higher. The mist parted slightly, revealing the outline of a fallen log. Only it wasn't a log. It was another carving, half buried in the soil, grown over with moss. Its shape was unmistakable. Wings, head, and the hollow eyes of an owl. Larger than the one he had made, too detailed to have been done by hand. He brushed away the dirt with trembling fingers. The wood was smooth, polished by time. "Who carved you?" he whispered. The forest didn't answer, but the air shifted. He felt it against his cheek, the first hint of movement in months. Not a wind, not yet, but the memory of one. He stood there for a long time, listening to the faint murmur that passed between the trunks. It wasn't language, but it wasn't random either. It was rhythm. The same heartbeat he'd felt beneath the bark, spreading now through root and soil and stone. By dawn, the sound faded. The fog lifted, leaving behind a damp silence. The man walked back to his cabin slowly, the wooden feather still warm in his hand. Inside, he placed it beside the real one on the table. Both gleamed faintly in the light. He sat down, tired but too aware to rest. Outside, the forest waited. He whispered to the room, "They haven't stopped dreaming. They just don't want to wake." As the sun climbed through the trees, the shadow of each branch moved across the window. Not quickly, not by wind, but by breath. The forest was alive again, though it refused to admit it. And somewhere beneath the soil, the pulse continued, slow, deliberate, patient, as if the trees were listening for the next cry that would finally let them sleep. The next evening came without a sunset. The clouds gathered low and flat, turning the air to pewter. No color, no light, just the dim weight of everything that had gone unsaid between the man and the forest. He had not meant to return to the clearing. He had told himself the night before that it was over, that the noise had been nothing more than a trick of age and silence. But the sound had not left him. It stayed beneath his ribs, a faint rhythm that matched his own heartbeat until he could no longer tell the difference. When the fog rolled back from the trees, he rose from his chair, took the lamp, and followed it. The forest greeted him with stillness, but not the empty kind. This silence had shape. It moved around him, shifting slightly, as if each step pushed through the space where sound should have been. The trees stood taller tonight, or maybe he had simply grown smaller. Every trunk bore lines of dark sap, still glistening from where he had pressed his hand before. He ran his fingers along one of the marks and felt warmth still pulsing beneath the bark. "You haven't stopped," he said softly. "You're still breathing." The air thickened in answer, heavy with the smell of wet wood and something faintly metallic, the same scent as the feather he'd found. At the well, the fog swirled but did not move away. The carved owl still sat on the rim, though its shape looked less certain now, softened by moisture, as if it was returning to the wood it had been born from. Beneath the mist, the faint vibration hummed, deeper, steadier, no longer pretending to be wind. He knelt beside the well and peered down. The water's surface was hidden, but something gleamed far below, a reflection or a flame, impossible to tell. He leaned closer, and the sound rose in his ears. Not words, not breath, but something that carried both. It wasn't calling to him. It was calling through him. He closed his eyes. The sound filled the space behind them, moving like liquid through memory. He saw flashes. The forest as it once was. Bright, endless, full of motion. He heard the calls of birds layered over the murmur of leaves, the distant hum of insects that never slept. And then, the cry. Sharp, final. The owl's last sound. It cut the memory in two. Everything after was stillness. When he opened his eyes, his hand was gripping the stone rim so tightly that the edges had cut into his skin. Blood mingled with the mist and ran down into the well. The sound changed again. The low hum deepened, spreading outward like ripples under the ground. The nearest tree shuddered, its bark splitting just slightly at the base. He stumbled back, lamp swinging wildly. "No," he whispered. "Don't wake yet." The forest ignored him. The vibration spread beneath the leaves, through the roots, across the soil. The sound was no longer quiet. It had weight, like something old trying to stand after too long in darkness. He turned to run, but stopped after 2 steps. The trees were moving. Not bending, not twisting, but shifting, inch by inch, in ways that defied their stillness. They leaned toward the well, their branches trembling as if drawn to the sound. He dropped the lamp. The flame sputtered in the wet earth, but did not die. The light flickered up through the fog, and for the first time he saw them clearly. Hundreds of trees circling, their bark glistening, each one marked with the faint outline of a hollow. Every tree had an absence carved into it, a place where something had once lived. Owls. The realization struck him like cold water. He walked forward, slow, unable to stop. He touched one of the hollows, smooth inside, warm to the touch. It pulsed faintly beneath his palm, as though the tree was remembering what it had held. He whispered, "You kept their shapes." Behind him, the sound in the well rose again, louder, clearer, no longer a hum but a low, melodic note that vibrated through his bones. The trees answered. Their hollows began to echo faintly, one after another, until the entire forest sang. A deep, wordless resonance built from memory and absence. It wasn't music. It was mourning. The man fell to his knees. The air around him quivered, the fog lifting in waves. He felt it moving through him, that sound. Not painful, but vast. It filled his lungs, his skull, every hollow place in his chest where grief had lived too long. He realized then that the forest hadn't fallen silent because it was empty. It had fallen silent because it was listening. The song rose higher, then broke. The vibration faded. The air settled. The mist returned. The man opened his eyes to stillness once more. The trees stood motionless, their hollows dark and quiet again. The carving on the well had vanished, replaced by a patch of wet moss. The sound was gone, but the air still carried its echo, faint, like a heartbeat continuing after death. He stood slowly, his knees trembling. "You dreamed," he whispered. "Just once more." The forest gave no sign of hearing him, but the wind, real wind, brushed his face, soft and brief. It carried the faint scent of rain and the sound of branches moving. Not singing, not speaking, just breathing. He turned back toward his cabin, the forest watching him in its quiet way. As he reached the edge of the trees, he looked back one last time. The fog closed behind him, sealing the clearing in gray. And somewhere deep within that gray, something shifted. The hollow echo of wings that would never return. The last memory of a cry that had taught the forest how to grieve and how to go on. The trees stood still, but they were not sleeping. They were dreaming again, slowly, carefully, for the first time since the owl's voice had faded. By morning, the fog was gone. The forest stood raw and visible, stripped of its veil. The man had not slept. He sat by the window with his hands around a cup gone cold, watching the line of trees as if they might vanish if he blinked. The silence outside was different now. Not the weight of absence, but the pause that follows a confession. He could feel it even here, inside the walls that still smelled of resin and damp earth. The forest had spoken, and now it was listening for his reply. When the first light touched the clearing, he went out. The ground was slick from the night's dew, soft underfoot. He walked without the lamp this time. The air was cool, thin, clear. Above, the sky was pale as bone, but the treetops glowed faintly green in the new light, leaves trembling as if remembering motion. He stopped at the well. The moss had spread across its rim, thick and damp, swallowing the shape of the carving that had once sat there. He touched it anyway. Beneath the softness, the stone was warm, still breathing. He whispered, "You're awake now." No echo, no wind. Only the sound of water dripping somewhere below, a rhythm too steady to be chance. He knelt and leaned over the edge, peering into the dark. The surface was still invisible, but something had changed. He could smell it now. Wet stone, sap, and the faint sweetness of decay. Living things. The trees around him stood straighter, their trunks dark with moisture. At their bases, the soil bulged slightly, like the earth had shifted overnight. He crouched and brushed his hand over the ground. The dirt pulsed under his fingers. Slow, steady, unmistakable. "You're not just dreaming anymore," he murmured. He pressed his ear to the earth. Beneath the damp layer of soil came a sound, faint but clear. It was not the hum he'd heard before, nor the song of the night prior. It was quieter, more intimate, like hundreds of voices whispering just out of reach. He could not make out words, but the cadence was familiar. He realized it was not one sound, but many. The low, murmuring dialogue of roots moving through soil, touching, crossing, speaking. He sat back, heart pounding. "You're talking to each other." He felt ridiculous saying it aloud, but the moment the words left him, the ground seemed to respond. A subtle tremor, not enough to shake, only enough to affirm. He stood, brushing dirt from his hands, his pulse echoing in his ears. The trees were no longer still. Their leaves quivered gently, though there was no breeze. The air felt charged, expectant. He took a few steps deeper into the forest. The light shifted as he moved, breaking into small, uneven patches. The deeper he went, the louder the whispering grew. a soft rustle beneath the surface of sound, like memory rearranging itself. He reached the hollow where the old owl carvings lay. The one he had unearthed was gone, its imprint filled with leaves. In its place, new growth had appeared. Small shoots, pale green, curling upward through the soil. He crouched beside them, brushing away the debris. The plants were young, delicate, too thin to survive the cold, and yet they stood unbent. He smiled faintly. You remember the shape of life. The wind, faint, almost human in its breath, moved through the upper branches, carrying the scent of wet bark and dawn. He closed his eyes and listened. The sound wasn't random. The forest wasn't repeating. It was learning. The murmurs below had cadence now, rhythm, the slow formation of something like language. He whispered, "You're trying to say it again, aren't you?" The name. The trees swayed in unison just slightly. He waited. The sound deepened, pulling the air downward. The ground trembled once, like a heartbeat skipping. A single drop of water rose from the well, suspended in midair for a breath, before falling back soundlessly. The man stepped closer, drawn by something he didn't understand. He placed both hands on the moss-covered rim. "I'm listening," he said. For a moment, nothing. Then, from the ground beneath him, a sound rose. Low, fractured, ancient. It came not from the well, but from beneath the forest itself. It was not the cry of the owl, not the hum of the earth, but the faint, broken attempt of something vast, trying to form a word. It failed. The noise collapsed into silence again. But in that instant, he understood. The forest had not lost its dreams. It had lost its voice. The owl's cry had been its last word, the sound that kept memory alive. Without it, the forest had forgotten how to speak, and now it was learning again. He sank to his knees. "Then I'll wait," he whispered, "until you remember." The roots below stirred once more, the tremor passing outward, spreading in rings across the soil. The sound that followed was not speech, but it was close, a low hum that filled his chest, that reminded him of how hearts used to sound when the world still had something to love. He stayed there until dusk, listening. The forest did not fall silent this time. It breathed, it murmured, it lived. When he finally rose to leave, he turned back once, looking at the trees silhouetted against the fading sky. The light behind them was gold now, soft and uncertain, the color of something returning. He whispered to the dark, "When the owl comes again, tell him I waited." As he walked home, the last light caught the bark of the nearest tree, and for a moment, in that warm, dying glow, it looked as though the trunk itself exhaled, slow, deep, alive. And beneath his feet, the roots whispered on, remembering what it meant to speak.